No problem.
Turn on.
Everything ready?
Yeah. Yes.
So I'll start by telling you a little bit about psychoanalysis. Now, that's not a very straightforward thing to do because there are a number of different schools of psychoanalysis and they don't come to the same conclusions. But I'm going to try to tell you what I think is common and deep among the different schools, and then give credit to the originators of the ideas where that's due. Psychoanalysis is, I would say, a romantic school of thought. And the reason for that is that for psychoanalysts, emotion and motivation are far more important than rationality. And I would like to point out that that's true. It's not a theory. We know a lot more about the limitations of rationality now, partly because of our explorations of artificial intelligence, than we did 120 years ago when the psychoanalysts started their theorizing. You can't think without motivation and emotion. In fact, you can't think without a body. And even if you had a body, you couldn't think without the surrounding social world. And so, for the psychoanalysts, and this is also true of thinkers like Nietzsche, you make sense out of the world because you're boxed in by society, and then you're boxed in by your body, and then you're boxed in by your motivations and emotions, and then only inside that circumscribed space can your rationality operate. And part of the reason for that is that most of the world is technically uncomputable. So, for example, if you play chess, here's an example. The fastest supercomputer ever invented cannot calculate all the permutations in a single chess game if it ran from the beginning of time till now. And that's just a chess game. And so what happens is that every action you take has consequences, and then those consequences have consequences, and those consequences of the consequences have consequences, and you can't compute your way through life. We orient ourselves through life by mechanisms we really don't understand. And the psychoanalysts figured that out from a quasi-scientific perspective before anyone else. Another way you can think about that is that for centuries, or for thousands of years, or maybe since the beginning of human consciousness, it was accepted as universal wisdom that human beings were the pawns of the gods, we might say. And these were, at minimum, causal forces with personality that operated behind the scenes and whose essential motivations were mysterious to us. Now, modern people no longer believe that, but the psychoanalysts began their theorizing from that fundamental perspective. Even Freud, who portrayed himself as rationally anti-religious, merely replaced religious notions with notions like the superego or the id. Now, he localized them inside, but whether the gods are inside or outside makes very little difference to whether or not there are gods. Now, what the psychoanalysts offered us that no other school of psychology has managed so far is the notion that human beings are basically a loose collection of spirits. Instead of entities that are transparent to themselves and primarily rational, for the psychoanalyst, you're like a room full of ghosts. And you, the you that you think you are, might be one ghost among all those ghosts, and it even might think that it's the ghost in charge, but the probability that the part about being in charge is true is zero. It's simply not the case. And one of the other things that the psychoanalysts have to offer, which neither the cognitive scientists nor even the emotional neuroscientists have realized, is that the structures through which we look at the world and also the structures that motivate us are actually alive. We don't have mechanical cognitions. What we have is, what we are is a sequence of embodiment by different motivated spirits. And you know that perfectly well if you watch yourself behave over a 2-week period. You're a different person when you're angry, you're a different person when you're afraid, you're a different person when you argue with someone you love, you're a different person when you're confused. You know, you're a different person when you're egotistical, you're a different person when you're wrong. And it takes a tremendous amount of psychological development before there's any coherence across those multiple selves, except the coherence of memory and post hoc rationalization. Now, one of the most terrifying realizations that the psychoanalysts lead people to is the realization that they are not alone in their heads. Now, you can debate whether or not the space that you inhabit is in your head, because I don't really think that's accurate, but I don't think you can debate the proposition that you are not alone in your being. And it's also very difficult to debate the proposition that you're not the captain of the ship, or if you are, there's plenty of skeletons below decks. Now, Freud, for his part, even though he was a 19th century rationalist, at least in terms of his formal thinking, was also someone who was painfully aware of the role of fundamental irrationality, romantic irrationality in people's lives. And Freud basically concentrated on the two elements of existence that were particularly anathema to the Victorians, and one of those was sexuality, and the other was aggression. Now, sexuality was problematic for the Victorians, not merely because they were repressive, but because sexuality is a terrible demon, so to speak. I mean, a large part of the movie that you just watched is an expression of the idea that sexuality is a terrible demon, and also that it's closely allied with aggression. I mean, the blonde woman is basically possessed, and she's possessed to the point where she becomes not only murderous but suicidal. And Freud attempted with all his might to point out to the Victorians, especially the aristocratic Victorians, who thought of themselves as rational masters, that they were embodied creatures with an animal nature, and that they were motivated in large part by forces that not only did they not understand, but they didn't even want to admit existed. Now, the blonde woman in the initial parts of the movie, when she's seen off by her uncle and aunt, is basically Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. You know, she's raised somewhere by loving relatives, and the aunt and the uncle, or the older couple, play that role. They wish her well in her wonderful adventure into Hollywood, and she naively accepts their benevolence as, you know, an appropriate way of interacting with her. And of course it's not appropriate at all. She's naive right to the bloody core. Whoever really were her parents did an absolutely dismal job of preparing her for reality. They allowed her to nurture naive princess-like fantasies that are so fractured and sketchy that they have zero adaptive utility, and they basically set her up for catastrophic failure. And from the Freudian perspective, that's an Oedipal story, because the fundamental lesson of Freud's Oedipal theory is, do not let your theoretically benevolent caretakers delude you into naive faith. So in the Freudian scheme of things, the Oedipal mother, for example, infantilizes her son. Now, Freud read that as a familial pathology, and Jung read that as a mythological pathology, even though Freud did talk about Oedipus as a myth. And Freud's basic idea with regards to the Oedipal complex was that it's very easy for a mother to entice her son, but even more broadly, for parents to entice their children into a false sense of dependent security by helping them pretend that the world is much more benevolent and simple than it really is. Now, Freud's observation of that was that the reason that the parents did that was twofold. One was that they were cowardly and unable to look at the world as it really was, and second, that their fundamental aim was to eradicate the independent strivings of their children so that they would never leave home, so that the parents didn't have to suffer from loneliness. So it's an ugly, ugly, ugly story, and this is partly why Freud is being met with so much resistance. There's lots of reasons, but he's absolutely right. I mean, Freud's basic Oedipal theory was that the most difficult thing that a human being has to do is to develop enough independence to break away from the maternal nest or the familial nest so that they can live an independent existence, and that there's multiple ways that that can be seriously interfered with, some of which border on incestuous. And I mean, I appreciated that when I first read Freud, but once I became a clinical psychologist, I thought, well, yeah, that's just exactly how it is. I never have anybody in my therapy practice whose parents made them too independent. That never happens. Never. I have any number of people in my clinical practice whose parents seriously interfered with their children striving towards independence. So, and Freud believed that was universal. He believed that the reason the Oedipal myth was universal was because it was very difficult for creatures who had as long a history of dependence as human beings and who were born so helpless to develop an independent identity, given the need for their protection across, an 18-year period. So Jung viewed that in a slightly more profound manner in some ways, because he thought of it as a problem that transcended the mere family, because Jung believed that one of the temptations of consciousness itself was to hide from reality, and that you didn't necessarily need any parental interference with your development to hide your head in the sand from the true nature of reality, like someone who was naive. So he believed that that was also an existential problem, and he believed that partly because he was a student of Nietzsche, who observed quite rightly that much of what passes for morality is in fact cowardice. And of course this movie picks up on that theme to some tremendous degree, because although Betty is very naive, part of that naivety is merely cowardice. She just doesn't have any life experience at all. And you see very rapidly in the movie that when she's actually presented with temptation, her facade of naive morality is eradicated instantly the second she's given any temptation. So she falls prey to the love affair. She hesitates not at all to break and enter. She ends up hiring a murderer. I mean, she's not a good girl, Betty, Betty like the Betty in the Archie comics. She's not a good girl at all. She's just someone who's so inexperienced and clueless that she lives in an Oedipal dream world. And she thinks of Hollywood as a magical fantasy place where dreams come true, like they do for Cinderella. And you see the Cinderella motif the first time she encounters the director and does her scene when she's singing like some princess, and then she has to run out at the last moment. There's a bit of a brief utilization of the myth of Cinderella in there, just like there is utilization of the idea of the Wizard of Oz. I mean, Betty is basically Dorothy, and you see the great and wonderful Oz manipulating things behind the scenes. So the psychoanalytic perspective is that people are inhabited by multiple spirits, and they are not clearly the masters in their own houses. And as far as I'm concerned, to not believe that is mere naivety. It seems to me, especially as a consequence of thinking of it for so long, that it's self-evidently true, and that if people merely meditate on that in their own life for any period of time, they can understand that very rapidly. Now, the second thing that the psychoanalysts really brought to the forefront, along with their emphasis on irrationality, so motivation and emotion, say, was their emphasis on both the unconscious and on dreams. Now, Freud was really the great formalizer of the idea of the unconscious, although there were many precursors to that idea. The archaic idea of the underworld, for example, is a romantic and religious precursor of the idea of the unconscious. The ancients externalized the unconscious and thought about it as the place of gods, whereas by the time we hit Freud, we started to believe that most of the unexplained complexity in the world was actually localized inside our head, which is not clearly true. Anyways, for Freud, and then again for Jung, the unconscious was the place of either disguised secrets, which would be the Freudian viewpoint, or knowledge that had not yet come to be, which was the Jungian viewpoint. Now, I think Jung wins that argument hands down, although I have seen people who were compartmentalized in their thinking in exactly the manner that Freud described. Now, Freud believed that fantasies, in some sense, and you could include this movie as an example of fantasies like that, were essentially wish fulfillments, and that what they fulfilled were unconscious wishes. And unconscious wishes were often wishes that were generated by parts of the psyche that had either not been allowed to manifest themselves properly, let's say in the case of sort of id-generated fantasies, or that had been actively repressed. The ability to distinguish between what's merely underdeveloped and what's actively repressed, that's not such an easy distinction to make. And it's conceivable that it's valid, especially in situations that are like the Freudian Oedipal situation, where people are raised in situations where all sorts of things are merely not allowed to exist, which is Betty's state of mind when she naively encounters Hollywood. For Jung, the situation was more complex, and I think Jung had a dream once that he was excavating a basement with Freud, which is of course essentially what he was doing, and that he dug underneath what Freud was digging, was excavating, and he found an immense cellar, basement, mansion with thousands and thousands of rooms. And I think that's exactly right. I think that is what Jung did in relationship to Freud. It was in some ways as if Freud opened the door and Jung stepped through it. And it was very hard on Freud, because there were limits to the places that he was willing to go, even though he was a very courageous person. Jung believed that dreams could be revelatory, and he has a very, very, very sophisticated theory about how that might come about. So for Jung, the dream was, and you can include in the dream all genuine art, all genuine literature, all the elements of human creativity that we would consider fine arts or humanities based, anything that's like that, that's not ideological, would fall for Jung under the rubric of compensatory fantasy. So Jung's idea was that the ego basically attempted to impose a coherent and somewhat simplified perspective on the world, which would be like Betty's initial viewpoint, and that the fantasy world did everything it could to account for what that system could not account for, and then to try to start making sense out of it. And the reason it used fantasy and dreams and artistic productions and so on, even rituals, is because the non-understood reality has to be acted out and presented in image before it can be understood in any articulated manner. So for Jung, it was also a theory of the progression of knowledge. So for Jung, the intellect and articulated knowledge occupied a very limited and circumscribed space, and then outside of that area there was the dream world, which included all of artistic production, and then outside of that was the unknown itself. And the way the unknown was transmitted to the conscious articulated mind was through a lengthy process of dreamlike representation. And every time you go see a movie, or every time you read a book of fiction, or every time you have a fantasy or a dream, you're participating in the process by which what's truly unknown is transformed through the dream into articulated knowledge. And any genuine artist does that. And this is part of the place where I have some trouble with David Lynch, because Lynch is clearly a post-Freudian. He's like Salvador Dali. And psychoanalytic thought can easily become ideological. It happened very frequently with Freud's followers. It happened in the case of artists like Salvador Dali, too, who would take Freud's excavation of symbolic language and then use it consciously in a manner that aped or mimicked true spontaneous symbolic revelation. And I can never escape the deep suspicion that Lynch is doing exactly the same thing. He's a little too calculated for me, you know, and because the film, for example, could be laid out in a linear structure, but it's as if he laid it out in a linear structure and then randomized it. which I think is a rather cheap trick. And the film lacks, I think, what you see in truly deep symbolic movies, which is the revelation of something beyond understanding. What Lynch attempts to make the audience feel, as far as I'm concerned, is that he is revealing something that's not yet understood. But I think Lynch understands too well what he's doing, and he's playing a Freudian game with the audience, just like Salvador Dali did. Now, that doesn't mean he isn't creative, because he is, and the film is fascinating to watch, but there's something about it that there's a lack of spontaneity about what he's doing that to me makes him into a quasi-Freudian ideologue. And that sort of thing is generally not that helpful. A real artist is someone who isn't using symbols to express what they're attempting to express. A real artist is attempting to express what has not yet been expressed and has no choice other than to use imagistic or symbolic representations, because there isn't anything else yet. And you can really see this when you read someone like Nietzsche, but even more so in the case of Jung, because Jung is quite obscure. But the reason he's obscure is because the things he was writing about are way more obscure than Jung. So you can see this especially in his writings about alchemy. I mean, alchemy is so obscure that it's basically incomprehensible. And Jung's writings on alchemy are almost understandable. And that actually constitutes a move forward. But Jung is not trying to be obscure. He's trying to be as clear as he possibly can. Whereas with Lynch, I feel, every time I watch a Lynch movie, I feel uneasy and as if I'm being manipulated, because the complexity is more than the information demands. So he's playing a game, and I think that that's a pseudo-intellectual move, because what someone who's genuinely exploring is trying to do is to lay out something complex as simply as possible. Now, it still may be incredibly complex, but the complexity isn't added for the point of mystification. And Lynch plays so many games, and I think I've seen most of his films, that I just can't suppress the notion that there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. So, all right, so what's the basic theme? And then I'll stop. What's the basic theme? Well, the basic theme to me is the terrible gap between naive and motivated innocence. So it's overprotected fantasizing, and the cataclysmic sexual and aggressive nature of reality. And Lynch weaves together a narrative of an innocent and naive, not innocent, naive. They're not the same thing. A naive girl who has unrealistic expectations both of the world and of herself, and her absolutely traumatic encounter with the subterranean realities of the LAC. Now, we do know, just so you know, that if you want to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which is sort of what happens to the girl in this movie, the best way to do that is to be really, really naive and then go somewhere horrible. And that'll do it. And often what the clinical observations are is that when soldiers, for example, go off to battle and develop post-traumatic stress disorder, it's often because of something that's revealed about themselves rather than something that they see. So, there are cases, for example, of post-traumatic stress disorder where people are on duties like body cleanup. But generally speaking, soldiers develop post-traumatic stress disorder when they see themselves doing something they could never imagine doing. And what that means to some degree is that they're naive about the true nature of themselves and of humanity in general. They're put in an extreme situation. Poof, they do something that's within the extreme capabilities of human beings, and it just shatters the little ideology that they used to see the world. Now that happens to this girl to some degree. I'll just say a little bit about movies in general, and I would also like to say a little bit about how genuine revelations are possible. Because one of the claims that the Freudians made the claim that dreams could reveal to you things that you had repressed. Because what Freud hypothesized was basically that your mind operated like a video recorder in some sense, that you were recording reality all the time, and that what you were recording was reality, and that there were some elements of that reality that you didn't find acceptable because of your familial or cultural conditioning, and so you would just put those somewhere, which would be the unconscious, and forbid them to emerge, in which case they would emerge in fantasies and dreams in a somewhat warped sense, and they would have to disguise their true content, hence symbols, so as to not upset the thing that was doing the repressive. Now, there's a whole bunch about that that's wrong and too complicated. First of all, you don't record reality like a videotape. Second, lots of things happen to you that you don't understand, so you don't have to repress them to not be clear about them, you just don't understand them. Third, there's no real evidence for the kind of censoring or a censoring mechanism that Freud talked about. Jung, on the other hand, said, no. The dream is doing its best to make something that's not clear, clear. Now, it can't make it any clearer than it is making it, because that's the limit of understanding. Now, that's exactly what you're participating in when you go to a movie. So you can imagine there were some comments about anthropology earlier. Every person is an anthropologist of him or herself and the culture. We're all wandering around doing things we don't understand. Part of the reason we can do things that we don't understand is because other people have taught us how to do things. We have actor or a great literary figure or a great movie director is someone who's capable of extracting out those patterns and representing them in a way that's captivating, because they have to captivate your interest, which is a strange thing, and also more or less articulated. And that's how what's deeply unconscious, it's so unconscious that it's merely acted out, that's how what's deeply unconscious starts to become articulated. And hypothetically, what Lynch is doing is participating in that process, although, as I said, I think that he's somewhat of he's a Freudian ideologue. And the reason I think he's an ideologue is because someone who's genuinely, as I said, someone who's genuinely experimenting does not use symbols. They don't use them. What happens is the manner of expression that they're attempting to use naturally takes the symbolic form. And that way they're extending their knowledge beyond their own limits. And I don't believe that that's what, I do not believe that that's what Lynch does. I think he's in the same, somebody mentioned surrealism. I think he's in the same intellectual tradition as people like Wells, who is also a very conscious manipulator of forces. So in some sense, an ideologue, someone who I think is capable of fascinating elements of those. I think he's something like that. underneath. And of course, LA is where all the movies are made, but it's also where most of the pornographic movies are made, although, you know, Eastern Europe is coming up pretty hard behind that. So there's the myth, the fantasy. It's not even a myth, it's a naive fantasy. And then there's the actuality. And I mean, LA is a fascinating place, partly because it contains so many contradictions. But, you know, it's definitely the place where dreams go to die. So, and that's certainly what's portrayed, at least in part, in this movie. So that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you.